The rain fell in relentless grey sheets against the large paned windows of the Gilded Spoon, blurring the bustling London street into a watercolour of red buses and black umbrellas. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of roasted coffee beans and buttery croissants. For Clara Mayhew, the hiss of the espresso machine and the gentle clink of ceramic on saucer were the soundtrack of her life. It was a life lived on her feet, a life of forced smiles and endless excuse-me's, but it was the life that was paying for her literature degree, one lukewarm tip at a time. Clara moved with an economy of motion born from years of practice, her worn black apron a second skin. She refilled a sugar dispenser here, wiped a phantom smudge from a marble tabletop there, her eyes constantly scanning the room. Her gaze softened as it landed on her favourite customer, seated in the plush velvet armchair by the window. Mrs. Eleanor Vance was a fixture at the cafe, a wisp of a woman with eyes the colour of a faded summer sky and hands gnarled with age and arthritis. She came in every day at 2 o'clock, ordered a single Earl Grey tea with lemon, and made it last for 2 hours, nursing the warmth of the porcelain cup as she watched the world hurry by. Clara believed Mrs. Vance wasn't just there for the tea. She was there for the human connection. A widow for nearly a decade, her children scattered across the globe. The Gilded Spoon was her living room, and the staff, her surrogate family. Clara always made a point to spend a few moments with her, asking about the book she was reading or complimenting the soft cashmere shawl draped over her shoulders. "Another refill, Eleanor?" Clara asked softly, approaching the table with a silver teapot in hand. Mrs. Vance looked up, a gentle smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "Oh, you're a dear, Clara, but I mustn't. Any more caffeine and I'll be up all night watching those dreadful shopping channels." Clara chuckled, a genuine warm sound. "We can't have that. You need your rest. How is A Tale of Two Cities treating you?" "It's a return to an old friend," Mrs. Vance said, her fingers tracing the worn cover. "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done," she quoted softly. Dickens always knew how to get to the heart of things, didn't he? Before Clara could reply, the chime above the door rang with a sharp, demanding clang. It wasn't the usual gentle tinkle. This sound had an edge of impatience. 3 figures swept in, shaking expensive-looking umbrellas onto the polished floor and bringing a gust of cold, damp air with them. They were young, dressed in clothes that cost more than Clara's monthly rent, and carried themselves with an aura of unshakable entitlement. The one in the lead, a blonde with a razor-sharp bob and a bored expression, scanned the room as if it were a slightly disappointing acquisition. "Is this it?" she drawled, her voice loud enough to turn heads. "It's quaint." The word was meant as an insult. Her 2 companions, a young man with overly gelled hair and a vacant athletic build, and another young woman who was a near-perfect echo of the first, snickered in agreement. Clara felt a familiar tightening in her stomach. It was the premonition of a difficult table. "Good afternoon," she said, plastering on her professional smile as she approached them. "A table for 3? The blonde, Tiffany, didn't even look at her. She pointed a manicured finger at a prime table in the center of the room, currently occupied by a quiet couple. "We'll take that one. Tell them to move." Clara's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "I'm sorry, miss, but that table is occupied. I have a lovely booth over here." "I don't want a booth," Tiffany snapped, finally deigning to look at Clara, her eyes sweeping over the simple uniform with disdain. "I want that table. Is your manager here? Perhaps he can explain how customer service works." The manager, Mr. Henderson, a man whose spine was made of jelly when faced with wealth, seemed to materialize from his office at the mention of his title. He scurried over, his face a mask of anxious appeasement. "Miss Cromwell, what a pleasure." Of course, of course." He then bustled over to the unfortunate couple and, with a series of whispered apologies and a voucher for a free pastry, relocated them to a less desirable spot near the kitchens. Tiffany and her friends, Chad and Brittany, sauntered to their newly acquired table, dropping their wet coats onto an adjacent chair. They didn't thank Mr. Henderson or acknowledge Clara. They simply sat, already looking bored. Clara took a deep breath, schooling her features back into a polite mask. She grabbed 3 menus. As she walked towards them, a man in a quiet corner near the back of the cafe looked up from his laptop. He was dressed in a simple, well-fitting grey sweater and jeans, looking utterly unremarkable. No one would have guessed he was Julian Davenport, son of the real estate magnate who owned this building and half the block. He had been enjoying the anonymity, the simple pleasure of a good coffee and the patter of the rain. But now he lowered the screen of his laptop slightly, his attention caught by the little drama unfolding in the center of the room. He watched Clara's posture, the way she held her shoulders straight despite the flagrant disrespect. He had a feeling this was only the beginning. The next 30 minutes were a masterclass in petty tyranny. Tiffany Cromwell and her companions seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from making Clara's life as difficult as possible. First, the water was not cold enough. Clara returned with a pitcher filled to the brim with ice. Then the coffee was too bitter. She brewed a fresh pot. Brittany complained that her scone was too crumbly, a criticism so absurd that Clara had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from responding. Chad sent his sandwich back because the crusts were still on, despite the menu not offering a crustless option. With each trip back and forth from the kitchen, Clara could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her. There was sympathy in some, but mostly it was the uncomfortable avoidance of people who don't want to get involved. Mr. Henderson hovered nervously nearby, shooting Clara warning glances as if she were the one causing the problem. Throughout it all, Clara maintained her composure. She was a ship in a storm, battered by waves of condescension, but determined to stay afloat. Her rent was due next week. Her younger sister's textbooks weren't going to pay for themselves. So she smiled, she apologized, she fetched and carried, burying her frustration deep beneath layers of professionalism. Mrs. Vance watched from her corner, her teacup long since cold. A worried frown creased her brow. She had seen this kind of casual cruelty before, the arrogance of those who believe their wealth makes them better, and it made her heart ache for the kind young woman who always remembered her name. The final straw came when Tiffany decided she wanted a different type of tea. "This chamomile is insipid," she announced, pushing the cup away. "Bring me a peppermint, and be quick about it." Clara nodded, her smile feeling painted on and brittle. "Right away, miss." She returned with the peppermint tea and the pitcher of ice water to top up their glasses. As she leaned over to pour water into Chad's glass, Tiffany subtly stuck her foot out. It was a small, deliberate movement, easily deniable. Clara, off balance and weary, stumbled. The heavy glass pitcher tilted in her hand, and a cascade of ice-cold water splashed across the table, soaking the tablecloth and splashing onto Tiffany's designer handbag. A collective gasp went through the cafe. "You clumsy idiot!" Tiffany shrieked, jumping to her feet. "Look what you've done. This is a Valextra bag. It's worth more than your entire year's salary." I'm so sorry," Clara stammered, her face flushing with humiliation as she grabbed napkins, trying frantically to mop up the water. "It was an accident. I tripped." "An accident?" Brittany sneered. "It looked to me like you did it on purpose. Probably jealous." Mr. Henderson rushed over, his face pale with panic. "Miss Cromwell, I am so sorry. This is unacceptable. Clara, what is wrong with you?" "It wasn't her fault," a quiet voice said. Everyone turned. Mrs. Vance had risen slowly from her chair, her frail hands gripping the back for support. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of conviction. "I saw it. You," she said, looking directly at Tiffany, "you stuck your foot out." Tiffany's face contorted with rage. She was not used to being challenged, least of all by a nobody old woman. "What did you just say, you ancient hag? Are you senile? You should be in a home, not loitering in public places." "That is quite enough," Mrs. Vance said, her voice trembling slightly but her gaze unwavering. "There is no call for such ugliness. This young lady has been nothing but patient and professional, and you have treated her abominably." For a moment, Tiffany was stunned into silence by the sheer audacity of the old woman. Then a slow, malicious smile spread across her lips. She picked up her own full glass of water from the table. "You want to talk about ugliness? You want to get involved?" she said, her voice dropping to a menacing purr. "Fine." And with a flick of her wrist, she flung the entire glass of ice water directly into Mrs. Vance's face. The shock was absolute. The frigid water drenched the old woman's white hair, plastering it to her scalp and running in rivulets down her wrinkled cheeks and onto her cashmere shawl. She gasped, a small bird-like sound, her body shuddering from the cold and the sheer shock of the assault. The cafe fell into a dead, horrified silence. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of water from Mrs. Vance's chin onto the floor. Clara stared, frozen for a heartbeat, her own humiliation forgotten. All she could see was Eleanor, her kind, gentle friend, shivering and violated. A fire she didn't know she possessed ignited in her chest. "How could you?" Clara whispered, her voice shaking with a fury that eclipsed her fear. She took a step towards Tiffany, her hands clenched into fists. Tiffany laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. She had it coming, sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. She then turned her attention back to Clara, her eyes glittering with malice. She grabbed the heavy glass pitcher of water from the table. "And as for you," she said, her voice dripping with venom, "you need to learn your place." Before anyone could react, she upended the entire pitcher over Clara's head. A deluge of ice and freezing water crashed down on Clara, soaking her hair, her uniform, her very soul. The cold was so intense it stole her breath. It ran down her back, into her shoes, a complete and utter violation. Shivering uncontrollably, water streaming from her hair into her eyes, Clara stood there, utterly defeated. She had been assaulted, her friend had been assaulted, and all she could do was stand there and drip onto the floor like a forgotten rag. In the corner, Julian Davenport slowly, deliberately closed his laptop. The quiet observer was done observing. He stood up, and the atmosphere in the room, already thick with tension, seemed to suddenly drop several degrees. The silence in the Gilded Spoon was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Every eye was on the tableau in the center of the room. A drenched and shivering Clara, a shocked and dripping Mrs. Vance, and Tiffany Cromwell, standing with the empty pitcher in her hand, a triumphant smirk on her face. Chad and Brittany were snickering. Thoroughly enjoying the spectacle, Mr. Henderson finally broke the paralysis. But instead of rushing to his abused employee or the elderly woman, he scurried towards Tiffany, his hands fluttering nervously. "Miss Cromwell, please, I am so sorry for this disturbance," he stammered, his eyes darting towards Clara with pure venom. "This is entirely her fault. She provoked you. She is unprofessional, clumsy. I'll handle this immediately." He turned on Clara, his voice a harsh, accusatory whisper. "My office. Now, you are finished here, do you understand? Causing trouble, harassing our most valued customers." Harassing? Clara's voice was barely a croak, thick with disbelief and the chill that was sinking into her bones. "She threw water on an elderly woman. She assaulted me." "I saw what I saw," Mr. Henderson hissed, his face inches from hers. "I saw you antagonize Miss Cromwell's party from the moment they walked in. Now get out of my sight before I call security to have you thrown out." The betrayal was a physical blow, colder and more painful than the ice water. Clara looked around the room at the faces of the other customers. They were staring, some with pity, some with morbid curiosity, but no one moved. No one spoke up. They were all just spectators, unwilling to risk a moment of discomfort to stand up for what was right. She was utterly, completely alone. Her job was gone. Her dignity was in tatters on the floor, pooling with the spilled water. "That won't be necessary." The voice was calm, clear, and carried an unmistakable weight of authority. It cut through the tense atmosphere like a scalpel. Everyone turned towards the source. Julian Davenport walked forward from the back of the cafe. He moved with an unhurried grace, his expression unreadable, but for the cold, hard light in his eyes. He wasn't large or physically imposing, but his presence seemed to suck the air out of the room. He walked past Tiffany and her friends as if they were furniture, and went directly to Mrs. Vance. He shrugged off his own expensive-looking wool coat and gently draped it over the old woman's trembling shoulders. "Are you all right, madam?" he asked, his voice softening with genuine concern. Mrs. Vance looked up at the kind stranger, her faded blue eyes wide with confusion and gratitude. I think so," she whispered, clutching the warm, dry coat around her. "It was just the shock." "I understand," Julian said. He then turned to Clara. He looked at her, drenched and humiliated, and for the first time that day, someone looked at her not as a waitress, not as an inconvenience, but as a human being. "And you?" Clara could only nod, wrapping her arms around herself, unable to stop shivering. Tiffany, annoyed at having the spotlight stolen from her, let out an impatient scoff. "Who do you think you are? Her knight in shining armor, get out of the way. We're trying to get the manager to fire this incompetent little—" Julian held up a hand, a simple silencing gesture. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'll deal with you in a moment," he said, his tone flat and devoid of emotion. He then fixed his gaze on Mr. Henderson. "You're the manager here?" Julian asked. Mr. Henderson, flustered by this new interruption, puffed out his chest. "I am, and this is a private matter. This employee has been terminated for gross misconduct." "Gross misconduct," Julian repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Tell me, what part of gross misconduct covers having a pitcher of ice water thrown on you after your customer assaults an elderly woman?" "Now see here," Mr. Henderson blustered, "Miss Cromwell is the daughter of Jonathan Cromwell of Cromwell Holdings. They are very important clients." "I'm aware of who Jonathan Cromwell is," Julian said, his voice dangerously quiet. "He leases 3 floors in one of my father's buildings in Canary Wharf. A lease, I might add, that is up for renewal next month." A flicker of confusion, then alarm, crossed Mr. Henderson's face. Tiffany and her friends exchanged uncertain glances. "Your father?" Tiffany asked, a note of derision in her voice. "And who is your father? The janitor?" Julian turned his full attention to her. The polite concern was gone, replaced by something as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "My father," he said, his voice resonating in the now tomb-like silence of the cafe, "is Marcus Davenport." The name landed like a physical blow. Marcus Davenport, the billionaire. The man who owned half of London's prime real estate, including, as Mr. Henderson now realized with a dawning, gut-wrenching horror, the entire building that housed the Gilded Spoon. Mr. Henderson's face went from pale to ashen. He looked as if he was about to be physically sick. Tiffany's smug expression dissolved, replaced by a mask of disbelief and panic. Jonathan Cromwell was wealthy, but Marcus Davenport was in another stratosphere entirely. He was a kingmaker, a man who could crush Cromwell Holdings with a single indifferent phone call. "Davenport," Chad stammered, his bravado vanishing completely. "As in, Davenport Industries?" "The very same," Julian confirmed. He took a step closer to their table, his eyes sweeping over their shocked faces. "I came here today for a quiet coffee and to do a final review of this establishment. My father's company is in the final stages of acquiring the entire Gilded Spoon franchise. I was here to see if the management and service standards were up to our level." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And you have all been so wonderfully helpful in my assessment." He looked at Mr. Henderson, who was now visibly trembling. "You saw a loyal employee be physically assaulted and humiliated. You saw a vulnerable, elderly patron be abused. And your first instinct was to protect the abusers because you thought they had money. You sided with cruelty over decency. You are a coward and a sycophant, and you have no place in any organization I have an interest in. Consider your employment, not just here, but with the entire Gilded Spoon brand, terminated, effective immediately." Mr. Henderson opened and closed his mouth like a fish, but no sound came out. His world had just crumbled around him. Julian then turned his chilling gaze back to Tiffany, Chad, and Brittany. They shrank back in their chairs, their earlier arrogance replaced by a very real, very primal fear. "And now," Julian said softly, "we come to you." He pointed a finger not at them, but at the floor, at the disgusting puddle of spilled water, tea, melted ice, and grime from the soles of their shoes. "You seem to have a fondness for pouring things," he said, his voice a silken threat. "You seem to believe that your money gives you the right to humiliate people, to treat them as less than human. You wanted to teach this young lady her place." His eyes were chips of flint. "Now I'm going to teach you yours." He looked at the puddle, then back at them. "On your knees," he commanded, "all 3 of you. You're going to clean that up, with the napkins from your table." The command hung in the air, so outrageous, so utterly shocking that for a moment no one could process it. The other patrons stared, their mouths agape. Clara felt a jolt, a mixture of horror and a dark, undeniable flicker of satisfaction. Mrs. Vance, wrapped in Julian's coat, simply watched, her expression unreadable. Tiffany was the first to find her voice, a high-pitched squeak of indignation. "You can't be serious. That's disgusting. We're not doing that." "Oh, I am perfectly serious," Julian said, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, which somehow made it all the more terrifying. "You see, you believe in a world where your actions have no consequences, where you can inflict pain and humiliation without ever experiencing it yourselves. I'm simply introducing you to the concept of reciprocity. You created this mess. You created this ugliness. It seems only fitting that you should be the ones to clean it up." "My father will hear about this," Tiffany shrieked, falling back on her only defense. "He'll sue you. He'll ruin you." Julian almost smiled. It was a cold, predatory baring of teeth. "Please, tell him. Tell Jonathan I said hello. Tell him I'm looking forward to our chat about his lease renewal. And about the character of his daughter. Perhaps a video of this incident might find its way to the board of his company. I wonder how his shareholders would feel about the public face of Cromwell Holdings assaulting an 80-year-old woman over a cup of tea." He pulled out his phone. The screen lit up his face, casting it in an eerie, pale light. "I have the entire thing on video, by the way. From the moment you tripped Clara, to the moment you doused Mrs. Vance, to your little performance with the picture. High definition, excellent audio. I'm sure the Daily Mail would love an exclusive." The color drained from Tiffany's face. Chad looked like he was about to faint. Brittany began to cry, fat, silent tears rolling down her cheeks. The threat of public shaming, of a viral video that would follow them forever, was a far more potent weapon than any physical threat. Their social standing, their entire world, was built on a carefully curated image of perfection and power. A video like that would shatter it to pieces. "You wouldn't," Tiffany whispered, her voice trembling. "Try me," Julian said flatly. He gestured again to the puddle on the floor. "The floor, now. Or we can see how well this plays on the internet." It was a checkmate. Defeated, stripped of all their power, they had no choice. The social humiliation they had so gleefully inflicted on others was now being turned back on them, magnified 1,000 times. Slowly, awkwardly, Chad was the first to move. His expensive trousers crumpled as he lowered himself to his knees on the hard, wet floor. Brittany followed, her sobs growing louder. Finally, Tiffany, her face a mask of pure hatred and utter defeat, knelt beside them. The three of them, who had walked in like royalty, were now kneeling in a puddle of filth in the middle of a London cafe. "Clean," Julian commanded, his voice devoid of any pity. The room was so quiet you could hear the frantic, terrified breaths of the three on the floor. With shaking hands, Tiffany picked up a soggy linen napkin. Her fingers recoiled from the cold, gritty wetness. She dabbed at the edge of the puddle, her movements clumsy and filled with revulsion. Chad and Brittany followed suit, wiping pathetically at the mess, their designer clothes soaking up the dirty water from the floor. The sight was grotesque, a raw, brutal form of justice. They had poured water to humiliate. Now they were on their knees, cleaning their own filth in their own humiliation. After a few agonizing seconds that stretched into an eternity, Julian spoke again. "That's enough." They scrambled back, their hands filthy, their clothes stained and damp. They looked broken. "Now get out," Julian said, his voice flat. "You are banned from this establishment and any other property owned by Davenport Industries for life. If I ever see your faces again, I will not be so lenient." They didn't need to be told twice. Stumbling over each other, they scrambled to their feet, grabbed their coats, and fled from the cafe, not daring to look back. The door chimed softly behind them, a gentle sound that belied the ugliness of their departure. The tension in the room broke. A few patrons started to clap softly, a hesitant, then growing, round of applause. Mr. Henderson, who had been frozen in horror, made a move to speak to Julian, likely to beg for his job, but Julian cut him off with a single dismissive look. "Security will be here in 5 minutes to escort you from the premises," Julian stated. "Leave your keys on the counter." Defeated, the former manager shuffled towards his office to collect his things, his career in ruins. Julian's harsh demeanor melted away as he turned back to Clara and Mrs. Vance. The cold executor of justice was gone, replaced by the concerned man from before. "Let's get you both somewhere warm and dry," he said gently. He spoke to the stunned kitchen staff who had witnessed the whole thing. "Please call a taxi for Mrs. Vance, a premium one. Bill it to me." He then looked at Clara. "And for you. I think we have a lot to talk about." Clara, still shivering, looked at this man who had descended like a wrathful god and dismantled her tormentors with a few quiet words. She didn't know what to say. "Thank you," was all she could manage, the words feeling hopelessly inadequate. "Don't thank me," Julian said, his eyes kind. "I should be thanking you. You showed me exactly what kind of person works here. You showed me grace and strength under circumstances that would have broken most people." He paused. "That's a quality my father's company values very highly." The promise of a new beginning hung in the air, as clean and fresh as the rain-washed London streets outside. 2 weeks later, Clara sat in an office that felt more like a glass-walled sanctuary than a place of work. It was on the 40th floor of the Davenport Tower, and the whole of London was laid out beneath her, a sprawling, intricate tapestry of history and ambition. The sharply tailored suit she wore no longer felt like a costume. It felt like armor. Julian sat opposite her, not behind a desk, but in a matching armchair, creating an atmosphere of partnership, not hierarchy. She was now the junior director of brand experience for the newly acquired cafe chain, a title she was still learning to inhabit. "I need you to understand the full picture, Clara," Julian began, his tone serious. He slid a tablet across the polished wood table. It wasn't a news article, it was an internal memo, stamped with the Cromwell Holdings logo and marked confidential. "Our cybersecurity team is exceptionally good. They intercepted this 2 days before the incident." Clara's eyes scanned the text. It was cold, clinical, and utterly damning. It outlined a strategy codenamed Operation Sour Milk, a plan to publicly discredit the Gilded Spoon at a key location to drive down the acquisition price. Her location. It listed potential provocations. It profiled the staff. Next to her name, a single chilling annotation. "Literature student. Financially vulnerable. High probability of emotional reaction." The breath left her body in a rush. They researched me? This wasn't random cruelty. It was a corporate strategy. I was just a target. A target, yes. But you weren't the one they miscalculated, Julian said, his gaze intense. What happened in the cafe wasn't just my reaction to a bully. It was the final move in a chess game that's been playing out for 20 years. He leaned forward. My father and Jonathan Cromwell built their empires at the same time. But my father built his with integrity. Cromwell built his on the ruins of other people's companies, on hostile takeovers and broken promises. He tried to ruin my father once, a long time ago. It nearly worked. This acquisition, this was personal. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her. This was bigger than a spoiled rich girl and a drenched waitress. This was a war. So when you walked in that day, I knew they were coming. I just didn't know exactly what they would do, he admitted. Which is why I brought my secret weapon. He smiled faintly. You know, Eleanor wasn't just my mother's best friend. She was her business partner in their first venture, a small publishing house. My mother was the dreamer. Eleanor was the one who could read a contract and see the venom hidden between the lines. She has the sharpest mind for human fallibility I've ever known. He recounted the conversation he'd had with Eleanor the night before. They'll use a sledgehammer, Julian, she told me over the phone. People like that always do. They can't conceive of a subtle victory. They'll go for the most visible, most humiliating attack they can think of. They'll underestimate the waitress because she's young, and they'll ignore the old woman because she's old. Let them. Let their arrogance be the stage, and we'll make sure the final act is ours. Clara was stunned into silence. The frail, book-loving widow was a master strategist. Her intervention hadn't been a spontaneous act of courage. It had been a calculated gambit to expose the full depth of Tiffany's cruelty, to push her past the point of no return. We knew they would be arrogant, Julian continued, his voice hard. We knew they would see a student and a senior citizen. They didn't see a future director and the godmother of their rival. They saw pawns when they were looking at a queen and a rook. And we used that blindness to corner their king. He swiped the screen, showing her a press release. As a direct result of the incident, the video of which I sent to Jonathan Cromwell's entire board of directors, he not only withdrew his bid, but was forced to sell us a controlling share in one of his subsidiary companies to avoid a public scandal. He essentially paid us to take his prize. And that £10 million donation to the new Davenport Vance Foundation for Elder Care, that's just the interest. A month after that rainy afternoon, Julian drove Clara to a part of the city defined by grim concrete monoliths. A sprawling community shelter stood cheerless under a perpetually grey sky. The air was heavy with the smell of damp, disinfectant, and quiet desperation. "The final clause in our agreement with Jonathan," Julian said, his voice neutral, 200 hours of community service, unpaid and unglamorous. He led her inside, their footsteps echoing down a long, peeling corridor. At the end was a large industrial bathroom. The stench of bleach, ammonia, and something fouler was overpowering. There, on their hands and knees, were Tiffany, Chad, and Brittany. The transformation was absolute. They wore drab grey overalls stained with grime. Tiffany's chic bob was a greasy, limp mess. Her manicured nails were broken and black with filth as she scrubbed a toilet bowl with a desperate, furious energy. Chad looked deflated, his muscles useless as he sullenly mopped the floor, spreading grey water into the corners. Brittany was weeping silently as she scraped mold from the grout with a toothbrush. A stern-faced supervisor watched them, her arms crossed. "Cromwell, you missed a spot. Again. Do you think this is a game? People live here. Show some respect." Tiffany looked up, and her eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, widened with pure hatred when she saw Clara. She scrambled to her feet, the toilet brush dripping murky water. "You?" she spat, her voice a venomous hiss. "This is your fault. You came here to gloat, didn't you? Walking around in your new suit with your new boyfriend." Clara looked at her, at the pathetic, dripping brush held like a weapon. The shivering, humiliated girl from the cafe was gone. In her place was a woman who understood the cold calculus of power. She felt not a shred of fear, only a profound, weary pity. "You think this is my story, Tiffany?" Clara's voice was calm, the quietest thing in the echoing room, yet it cut through the stench and misery. "You're mistaken. You always saw the world as a stage for your own drama. You cast me as the victim, Eleanor as the frail extra, the manager as your loyal servant. You thought you were the author." She took a step closer, her gaze unwavering. "But a character's true nature isn't revealed when they're in control. It's revealed when they lose it. This," she said, gesturing to the filthy bathroom, to the dripping brush, to Tiffany's broken expression, "this isn't a chapter I wrote for you. This is the epilogue you wrote for yourself, with your own actions, on a page you didn't even know you were turning. I didn't come here to gloat. I came to close the book." She turned and walked away, Julian by her side, leaving Tiffany standing speechless in a kingdom of filth, her impotent rage echoing off the grimy tiles. The true culmination of their downfall, however, was not in a foul-smelling bathroom, but in a glittering ballroom. The inaugural gala for the Davenport Vance Foundation was the most talked-about event of the season. At a table near the back, placed with exquisite, deliberate cruelty, sat Jonathan Cromwell and his daughter. They were pariahs in evening wear, their faces masks of stone as the elite of London society offered them polite, icy smiles before turning away. Attendance was another non-negotiable clause in their surrender. Eleanor Vance, the foundation's namesake, was the evening's queen. Dressed in a shimmering silver gown, she was surrounded by admirers. Before the main address, she found Clara backstage. "Remember, my dear," Eleanor said, her eyes twinkling with fierce intelligence, "Dickens didn't just write stories. He changed child labor laws. Words have weight. They can build prisons, or they can build sanctuaries. Choose yours wisely." Julian gave Clara's hand a reassuring squeeze before she walked to the podium. The room fell silent. Hundreds of eyes were on her, including the burning, hateful stare of Tiffany Cromwell. Clara began, her voice steady and clear. She didn't speak of corporate battles or viral videos. She told a simple story. "There is an old saying," she began, "that some are born with a silver spoon in their mouth. But what is the value of that spoon if it is used only to stir bitterness? What good is its polish if it reflects only a cold and empty heart? I have learned that the true measure of our worth is not in the gilded things we possess, but in the simple warmth we offer. It is found not in a silver spoon, but in a simple porcelain cup, held in trembling hands, offering a moment of dignity on a cold, rainy afternoon." She spoke of the Foundation's mission to ensure that the elderly, the keepers of stories and wisdom, would never be made to feel invisible or disposable. Every word was a tribute to Eleanor, and every sentence was a perfectly aimed dart, landing with pinpoint accuracy on the Cromwell's public facade. The cameras flashed, capturing Jonathan's grim face. Tiffany's barely contained tears of fury. They were trapped, forced to applaud a narrative that so elegantly and publicly condemned them. The following week, the grand reopening took place. The gilded spoon was gone, replaced by elegant, warm lettering that read, "The Vance Corner." It was a sanctuary of coffee and literature. In the prime spot by the window, a plush armchair sat permanently reserved, a brass plaque on the table beside it, reading, "For Eleanor, the best pair of eyes in London." Clara, holding a tablet, was confidently briefing the new staff. "Our policy is simple," she said, her voice clear and firm. "We treat every single person who walks through that door with dignity. No exceptions. The person clearing the tables is just as important as the person paying the bill." She felt Julian's presence behind her. He was sitting in a quiet corner, much like before, but this time he was her partner. He raised his coffee cup in a silent toast. As she approached, he placed a small, beautifully wrapped gift on the table. Inside was a leather-bound first edition of A Tale of Two Cities. "I thought you should have a better copy," he said softly. "After your speech, it seemed fitting. You command stories now, Clara." Clara ran her fingers over the gold-leaf title. The scent of aged leather and paper was a perfume of resilience. She looked from the book to Julian's kind eyes, to the warm, bustling cafe she had helped create. The memory of the cold water was a faint scar, but it no longer held any power. It was a reminder that her story wasn't about the fall. It was about what she chose to build in its place. She opened the book to the famous last line, the one Eleanor had quoted. It was a far, far better thing that she did now, a far, far better life she was building than any she had ever known.